Perspective. If there's one thing that I can talk about with photography to a new photographer is to understand perspective. You could take some courses by artists on perspective and you'll learn about planar, linear, curvilinear, atmospheric, and other geometric shapes of perspective. But in photography, I think perspective for me has been distilled down to the following basic concepts. When you take a picture, you are capturing a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional space. The relationship between foreground subject, midground subject, and background subject will be different depending on the angle of view of the lens that you're using and the distance from you to the primary subject and therefore the other things in the scene. If you are using a normal perspective lens, let's call that for me 40 millimeters, for others it may be 50, for others it may be 35. But for me, I'll use 40 millimeters as a normal perspective, 35 millimeter equivalent focal length. That puts everything in that three-dimensional space in a certain relationship. If you move forward or backward through the scene, you will change the relationship between the elements. That changes the focus, that changes the physical proximity or overlapping of different objects. And so you have to learn how to do that three-dimensional to two-dimensional computation in your head. So you need to go into a scene, look at it, figure out beforehand in your mind what that image might look like, and the importance of using a fixed focal length of a relatively normal perspective is the best way to learn that. I have two focal lengths which I use for most of my photography. One is 28 millimeter equivalent, the other is 40 millimeter equivalent. And that correlates to two values which over the past century have more or less been established to be a wide angle and normal angle lens. Anything for me beyond 50 millimeters is looking telephoto, where there's a compression of the foreground element to the background element. Anything wider than 28 to me begins to look artificially distorted, particularly at the periphery. So smartphones today use 24, 26 millimeters equivalent, and telephoto lenses use 55 or up. And that's what you're going to find. It's going to give you those distortional images, those distortions of perspective. So you need to use a fixed focal length on your camera. You need to walk into a scene. You need to try to determine what you're going to focus on, what your primary subject is, and the relationship of everything as it's going to appear in front of you as it's going to be translated into a two-dimensional photograph. I think that is key for me to understanding the basic principle of photography. Now, you can divert this into a discussion about gear and lenses in particular. And so I'm talking 35 millimeter equivalents. I happen to shoot with APS-C sensors more often than not. And so instead of 28, it's 18.3 or something like that. But that's fine. The size of the sensor and the lens will determine the depth of field of the image. And in general, you do want a greater depth of field for most things, unless you are trying to shoot portraits, in which case you actually probably want a slightly lower depth of field. But there are limits to normal vision. When I've put together portfolios and you give it to a photo editor to look at, they can immediately tell which photos are taken with a telephoto lens 100 millimeters or greater because of the compression of the depth of field. Most of my best photographs, as I say, are shot 28, 40, some 50, but the 50s are definitely portraiture work, and I've got some great 85, 135 portraits. But if I had to take a camera anywhere in the world on a trip and I only had one camera, one lens, it's going to be about a 40 millimeter, 35 millimeter equivalent. But the perspective is the most important thing, and you need to understand and learn three-dimensional to two-dimensional perspective translation, and you need to learn that with a piece of kit that you are comfortable with. One of the worst things you can do is go into a scene and take a variety of different images with different focal lengths and a zoom lens, because you don't really learn anything. You just grab things, and then later you realize, I missed this or I missed that. Alright, so that's the most important lesson that I can give you about photography, and that is perspective.